When it comes to understanding education and helping students learn best, it's important that we understand how we can do that as teachers and different ways that are set up in order to help us do that and achieve those goals in a simpler way. One way that we do this is intervention. Intervention is a big part of schools and how it helps kids function and reach their goals successfully or reach those milestones throughout the school year. The goal that I wanted to prove today, or the idea that I'm giving my TED Talk on, is why is Tier 1 the most important part of the RTI framework? First, let's talk about intervention and what it is. When I was in school, I was always in reading intervention, whether it was small group intervention, whole group, or individual intervention. I was in something. When I was younger, it was more small group, or I would be in a big old group of students and we would section off based on how we were developed in our reading skills. The lower group would all stay together in a full class, then the next highest group, and so on and so forth. Same with smaller groups, it's just a little more focused. And then I also had interventions where I went one-on-one with teachers and I spent time reading different running records and doing different activities that help build my different reading skills. While doing this, I did this all the way up until 4th grade, and I learned that intervention helped me, but I also learned the different tiers of intervention that I was going through and how I was able to better understand. When I was doing whole group instruction, it's because I was understanding what was going on. When I was doing smaller group instruction, it was because I was somewhat understanding, but I still needed a little extra guidance. And when I was doing whole group instruction, it was a more centered, focused idea that I should have been grasping the concept of. And if I wasn't, I was still had some time to catch up and had the opportunity to make right with the materials and better understand it before moving on to something else. Along with that, we look at the different stigma that comes along with intervention. The stigma that comes along with intervention is that some people have a bad stigma that comes along with it, such as you don't need that extra help or extra assistance or however it may be. But when looking at the National Institute of Health, it says stigma behind intervention in schools can be seen in two ways, understanding and not, which is simple enough. You either understand what intervention is and how it can be set up to help students, or you don't and you see a bad stigma behind it and see it as something that you don't want your student to be or your child to be in, or something that is seen as needing extra help or having slower skills or delayed learning development skills. Looking at the enrichingchild.com, we see that intervention is categorized and defined as extra instruction outside of the typical classroom time that helps students catch up on their performance goals and become successful by limiting negative behaviors. By learning this and better understanding what intervention is, we're able to understand what intervention is and how it helps. From here, we're able to understand the different tiers. Like I talked about, I was in all 3 tiers of intervention, which would be targeted intervention. Like I said, this would be individual intervention, which would be one-on-one, you with an intervention specialist working on different skills. The selected group would be like a small group session, something along the lines of a guided reading, not necessarily, but a smaller group activity, 3 or 4 students. And then the universal, where it can be a whole group lesson. This can be where it should be something that students should be able to adapt. This is where about 80 or 90% of students are going to fall, and they should be able to follow along with the lesson. And if they're not, it's something that they may fall behind on that little part, but the next part they're going to be able to catch up on, and it will help them better understand. So going from there, we're able to see, like I said, Tier 1 is the universal core instruction or whole group. Tier 2 is a targeted or strategic instruction or the small group. And then Tier 3 is the intensive intervention or the individual instruction. All the different tiers are important, and they're all important because they help to build the intervention and what it is itself. I think that Tier 1 is the most important when it comes to RTI framework because it allows you to get the idea of where the students are to start getting them in the process of doing all the different interventions and seeing where they actually need to be. Now let's talk about RTI. What is RTI? RTI is the response to intervention. From RTIActionNetwork.com, we get the definition that RTI measures skills and uses data to decide parts of RTI which intervention uses. Some schools use this so that they can see the social and the emotional as well as the academic needs that the student has. It's just basically a way that they're able to measure the skills and use the data that they have to better understand where a student needs to be and how their response to intervention should be. If a student is falling severely behind, they're going to be in that individual or that intensive intervention, which is tier 3. If they are kind of falling behind just a little bit and maybe just need a little extra intervention where the teacher can come around and give them a little guidance as they're going, then they're in tier 1. That's what we're talking about today. We're talking about why tier 1 is the most important tier when it comes to the RTI framework. Now that we better understand what RTI framework is, we're going to look at understand.com and we're going to see that it says that RTI must be research-based with its teaching message for whole group instruction, small group instruction, anything like that. The Tier 1 and RTI framework is universal instructions for all students, which is research-based. That's what RTI is, and that's what Tier 1 should be. It's a whole group universal instruction that's research-based. When we look at the different framework that makes up RTI, we see that we have to do some screening on the students. Screening is the first step. As the teacher, we're going to do the screening and make sure that we understand where the student is, the different progresses they're making, everything along those lines. Then we're going to go to the progress monitoring. This is where the teacher monitors the child. They observe these skills. They see their behaviors. They better understand the student and where they may fall into the lines of RTI or how they will respond to intervention or where they should be. Then we have the multi-level prevention system, which is just the different levels, the 3 different tiers where they should go, and it's balancing out, trying to figure out where these students should go based on the different screening, monitoring, and everything else that we've developed from the students so far. And all of this is going to be data-based decision making. So when we're screening the students, we're using data-based decisions to screen the students and figure out what we're actually looking for when we screen them and test them. Same as when we're progressing or checking or monitoring their progress. We're going to be using data-based research to better understand how the students should be monitored or what skills we should be observing and looking for. When we look at this and we look at the different tiers of the RTI framework, we see that Tier 1 is the most important when looking at RTI framework because we see that it's the basis of understanding intervention and where the student needs to be. Most students, 80 to 90% of students are going to be in Tier 1 of RTI or response to intervention. It's so important that we put so much emphasis on Tier 1 because so many students are in there. 90% of students is almost the whole class. If you have 20 students, that's 2 or 3 students that aren't included in this Tier 1 intervention. We need to make sure that all of the students in this Tier 1 intervention are included and accounted for and helped, so that way those other students that are in the Tier 2 and the Tier 3 where they need the more help and they have to develop more of the skills that the other students are working on, we're able to see that and we're able to move them to the right tier of intervention so they're not stuck in Tier 1 or a teacher hasn't simply put them in Tier 1 intervention because they're not sure what to do with them. Same going with putting them in Tier 3 and not understanding where their skills actually lie. It's really important that we focus on Tier 1 and we do all the research that we can to make sure that we have evidence-based research when we're doing our monitoring and screening and everything that goes along with the RTI framework and the intervention in Tier 1. It's just as important as the other 2 tiers of intervention, and I think that it shows that the students are actually going to be making progress if we pay closer attention to Tier 1 than we would paying attention to or focusing on Tier 2 or 3 where their students need more attention or need more attention or more focus on their skills. I think looking at RTI and Tier 1 is based on their progress. So I think that seeing the different progress and how the students have progressed over time is also huge and shows the importance of Tier 1. Seeing the development of all those students increasing in the 80% of the class whole is great, and it shows that we have the different layers of intervention for a reason. These students are able to complete the same skills while getting group intervention of about 20 students, while these other students that are in Tier 2 or Tier 3 intervention are only working with a few other students or by themselves, and they are also reaching this goal. It just shows that the importance of focusing on those Tier 1 students and making sure that they're getting the most out of their education is just as important as focusing on Tier 2 or Tier 3. To wrap up, I think that it's so important that we use RTI to make sure that we are putting the students in the right tiers. Even though I've focused this ed talk on how much the students benefit from Tier 1 and how important it really is to the framework of RTI, I think that it's important to see that we are using RTI the correct way, so that we are putting the student in the correct tier of intervention so that they can make the progress that they need, and we can have the child where they belongs in terms of learning skills and their capabilities in the classroom. Screening, database decisions, monitoring and screening, and making highly effective teacher questions and decisions, and all of that is a very important when it comes to the different RTI framework that comes along with Tier 1 and all the different tiers. For today, I made some very good points as to why I believe that Tier 1 was the most important part of RTI framework. There were lots of different websites I included besides the book that I felt were very good at helping me better understand what RTI framework was, as well as understanding the different tiers of education and why Tier 1 was so important. A couple other websites that I found some information for were navigatingeducation.com and understood.com. That is why I think that Tier 1 is the most important part of RTI framework. Thank you.